So welcome everybody to the second in a series of peer-to-peer webinars for RC&D councils. Today's topic is Watershed Protection-Reforestation after Wildfire. I'm Susan McKinney. I'm the Executive Director for Appalachian RC&D Council. We're located in the upper Northeast Tennessee area, and we're representing the National Association of RC&D Councils for this webinar series. We have a quick survey. I'm going to try to launch that. Sorry. So I'm launch this quick survey. It's only 3 questions. If you don't mind to complete it while we do a brief introduction. And joining me today is Dana York. She's retired Associate Chief for NRCS and facilitator for this webinar series. We have Justine Reynolds, who is with the Yosemite Sequoia RC&D Council, and Ralph Smith with NRCS Watershed Operations National Headquarters. I'd like to also thank and recognize board members of the National Association of RC&D Councils and Appalachian RC&D Council that are attending today. And the National Association has embraced a new model of engaging and supporting local councils. This new approach utilizes sub-awards that provide funds, leverage, local investment, and build capacity across the landscape. This approach was launched in earnest in June 2019, and for the past 14 months, more than 35 sub-awards have obligated $389,000 for projects across the country. The funds come from the USDA, NRCS, and facilitate outreach and training on farm bill programs, support youth interns, career development, and build partnerships with local and national conservation organizations. This is the first, or actually this is the second of multiple webinars that are being held with support of NRCS, with the goal of expanding these activities by highlighting success stories and creating connections. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Dana, and we'll end the polling. Hopefully you've got folks participating. If you want to go ahead, Dana.
All right, well, welcome to our second peer-to-peer meeting. We're excited to have our 2 speakers today, and as Susan said, our goal is to share 2 things. Usually we'll have an RC&D that will be featured, as well as having someone who is a subject matter expert, in this case Ralph, who's with the Watershed Operations in Washington. If you would take a second to put in the chat the name of your RC&D and where it is located if it's not in the name of the RC&D, so we can kind of see where everybody is. And with that, Rosie, if you can let Justine make her a presenter so that she can share her screen.
Yeah, she should already be able to.
Okay, so we are excited to have somebody that's been going through lots of activities over there on the West Coast. So Justine, welcome, and tell us a little bit about you and your RC&D, and then we'll look forward to your presentation.
Sure. Well, I did actually build in a little bit about Yosemite Sequoia before I start my presentation. It does actually need to be enabled for me to share.
Try it now.
There we go. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah.
And just to let you all know, I have a second screen, so if I'm looking to the left, it's because I'm looking at the screen to know what slide I'm on. So, I'm Justine Reynolds. I'm the Program Development Manager with Yosemite Sequoia Resource Conservation and Development Council. I'm here to talk about watershed protection and reforestation after wildfire. So Yosemite Sequoia RC&DC, like many other RC&DCs, we made the transition to becoming a 501c3 nonprofit, and we serve Fresno, Madera, Mariposa, and Tulare counties. Our council is made up of 21 sponsor organizations from all of those counties, including county supervisors, resource conservation districts, fire state councils, tribes, and nonprofits. Most of the nonprofits that work with us are either conservation easement organizations or recreation organizations. We focus on resource conservation, environmental education, and economic opportunities in the region. And some of our past projects have included meadow restoration planning and implementation, fuel reduction and hazard removal, and collaborative planning processes. We also have worked on surveys for folks. We do all sorts of things, including fiscal sponsorship for organizations in our region or projects in our region. So this is our service area. Currently, our service area is Madera, Mariposa, Fresno, and Tulare counties. But because of our participation in a California program, the Regional Forest and Fire Protection Program, no, that's a wrong acronym. The Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. We are also serving Kern County through that program through the end of 2021. And we're considering adding that depending on conversations with, I believe, the Desert Mountain RCD in that area. So we provide services to the foothill and mountain communities. We also work with local organizations, and we work with collaboratives and partnerships. In particular, we also partner with other organizations that work in the Valley area. You know, we have a huge agricultural center in the San Joaquin Valley, so there's a lot of headwaters to agriculture interface opportunities. Some of our key partners include Sierra National Forest, that we also work with Sequoia National Forest as well. We work with Sierra Nevada Conservancy, American Forests, North Fork Rancheria. I should have put CAL FIRE on here because we have a lot of CAL FIRE grants. And then we have a really good relationship with all of the RCDs in the area, Madera, Mariposa, Sierra RCD in Fresno, and Tulare RCD. So we mostly lean on those RCDs to sort of build on our agricultural relationship and relationship with NRCS. So I'm going to focus on one of our recently completed projects, the Eastern Madera Wildfire Reforestation Project. This was a joint partnership between Yosemite Sequoia and the Forest Service, and it was funded by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy with some additional funding from Arbor Day Foundation, whose logo did not make it into my slide, unfortunately. So I wanted to talk a little bit, because we're talking about watersheds, about the hydrologic regions. So on the left is a map of all of the hydrologic regions of California. And so the main one, the San Joaquin River, is actually in the middle of two, which is the San Joaquin and the Tulare Lake, which is the two brighter pink regions in that map. And so on the right is the San Joaquin River Basin, which is sort of right in the middle of California. It encompasses all the watershed availability for the San Joaquin Valley Agricultural Center, and also provides water through the San Joaquin Delta to the Bay Area, which is a huge population center for California. So the fire in question for recovery is the French Fire, which occurred right there on the San Joaquin River. So, you know, right in the middle of everything in the headwaters. So the French Fire took place in 2014. I believe it started in August. It was a summer fire as opposed to a fall fire. The French Fire burned over 14,000 acres of national forest lands on the Bass Lake Ranger District of the Sierra National Forest. This impacted the upper San Joaquin River watershed, and also was across the river from the Aspen Fire, which took place in 2013. And that area, particularly the lake up in the upper right-hand corner, is the Mammoth Pool Reservoir. And that was of particular impact to wildlife in the area that used that sort of area as a corridor for crossing the San Joaquin River. In the end, the forest was able to cover 3,000 acres under NEPA that were in need of conifer reforestation due to high severity wildfire. And you can see from this map that we had almost 80%, they were huge amounts, almost 50% of the forest had more than 80% removal of trees. So, you know, there were huge areas where there was no legacy trees to provide reforestation. And here's some pictures of the results of the French Fire. You know, In subsequent years, this does not seem, I think other fires have sort of blown this out of proportion now, but it was a pretty bad fire for the San Joaquin River at the time. So what are the benefits of reforestation? As I mentioned, it restoring severely burned areas where natural regeneration can't occur due to, it cannot be reforested to natural forested conditions. So that would be, there's no legacy trees to provide seed stock. It also provides stabilization that reduces erosion of stream banks and meadows, and particularly in steep areas where, in steep canyon areas. It also can provide habitat and canopy cover that's beneficial for wildlife species such as Pacific fisher and spotted owl. Though the spotted owl is eventually, it will provide the cover that's needed for them. Additionally, some studies have shown that it can reduce sedimentation and improve water quality for downstream users. And also this reduction in sedimentation can benefit public utility infrastructure, including Southern California Edison and PG&E hydroelectric facilities. And this is a picture of Bass Lake, which is nearby. So the goals of our project were restoration of 350 acres of public lands through site preparation and reforestation. And that's part of that larger 3,000 acre goal that the Bass Lake Ranger District had. There also was a goal that Yosemite Sequoia was implementing of educating the public on the values of reforestation post-fire for water quality, canopy cover, and protected species through a variety of meetings, field trips, educational materials, and media. So as I mentioned, it was a partnership largely between Bass Lake Ranger District and Yosemite Sequoia. And it was, you know, we were providing the sort of grant administration support, which is, we've done a couple of grants now with the Forest Service where we provide sort of the grant administration support and outreach while they work on the actual implementation of the grant, which has been really helpful for us and actually has led to the development of a master stewardship agreement to sort of more formalize that relationship between our organizations. The funding for this project, a big chunk came from Sierra Nevada Conservancy through Prop 1 funding, which is water bonds here in California. We also, the Bass Lake Ranger District provided site preparation match, and we also received seedlings from Arbor Day Foundation for 2 years. So that resulted in about $78,000 in seedling costs. And in total, the amount that we were provided by Arbor Day for seedling costs for the entire Bass Lake Ranger District during that time was about $100,000. Just $78,000 went to this project. And in addition, Yosemite Sequoia provided some administration and outreach in kind. So here is the larger French Fire project area that I mentioned before. And the smaller area is the sort of project area that's about, I think we covered about 450 acres in case we had under the CEQA, in case we needed to, and that's the California Environmental Quality Act. So California has its own in addition to NEPA. And so that was the amount that the acreage that was covered. And then the treatment area ended up being, we had planting areas in 2018 and then herbicide in 2018 and planting in 2019. And you might wonder, you know, why herbicide? And I'll explain that in a second. So the treatments overall, we had 225 acres of tree felling, 225 acres piled and burned, 225 acres treated with herbicide. Those are all the same acres. And then 350 acres of reforestation. And this is some planting that had been done prior to the project at Mile High, which is sort of an overlook location. And so the whole reason we do herbicide is, so here is a 100% mortality stand about immediately after the fire. So, you know, pretty open and bare. And then you go a year later and you have 100% mortality stand with all of this bare clover that provides no opportunity for trees to establish. So, you know, there are a couple options that can be done for this. There's herbicide application and prescribed fire. For this particular case, the NEPA had covered herbicide application, so that was the treatment methodology that we used. Should I be answering questions during this or should I wait till the end?
Yeah, let's wait till the end. Yes.
Okay.
So so some of the challenges that we had during this project, the contractor costs were increasing the whole time. This was a project soon after the tree mortality emergency that was from 2015 to 2017. I mean, we started during the end of it. And so we were there, a lot of the trees were really dead, really fragile, very dangerous. And so we had to, a lot of the contractor costs were increasing, in some cases 3 times what we would normally expect for costs for a contractor. And we weren't getting any better bids. At one point, the Forest Service actually accepted none of the bids and tried to put it out again and still got similar bids for the project. So we also had some pretty heavy weather delays. We had significant weather, a lot of heavy rain in 2017 and 2018 that made it at times difficult to initiate project work. In some cases it was good for reforestation, but you know, heavy weather was really keeping us from doing our planting and doing site prep. And then also we had staff availability went down during active fires, and then during the government shutdowns, particularly in 2019. But we also found that some staff were able to, some of the Forest Service staff were able to continue working during the shutdown because they had this grant funding. So, you know, pros and cons. And then we also had several opportunities. So the seedlings provided by Arbor Day Foundation were an excellent resource. We held a volunteer planting day with the Enterprise Rent-A-Car staff that went very well. And then we also held a reforestation workshop in partnership with Madera County in March of 2018. And we also helped distribute seedlings throughout the county through this program. And so what were the results? So reforestation, we did a species mix of ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and incense cedar seedlings. And everything we planted was fungus resistant because we kind of have to do that now. In 2018, we planted 76,000 trees on 165 acres and 85,000 seedlings on 143 acres in 2019. Because of the increased contracting costs, we had reduced site prep acres, and that meant that we weren't quite able to reforest all of the acres we were hoping for. But the Forest Service made up for that this year, but I'll have more information about that in a sec because of the creek fire. So here's some pictures of the reforestation. You know, we had a lot of crews out there. It was really great work. Site preparation, we did tree felling, piling, and burning on all 225 acres. And here's some of the felling in progress. And here's the piles that they look like afterwards. And then herbicide treatment, we did about 201 acres of herbicide treatment. Herbicide treatment, we sort of reduced the herbicide treatment costs to try and make up for, or treatment acres to try and make up for the reforestation. You know, we have to balance costs with success of the project. And so, you know, here's like an example of a really bad spot with huge amounts of bear clover. And then that's what it looks like afterwards. And it's really, it makes it a lot easier for trees to establish the next year. So post-treatment, we were looking to install interpretive signage, and this is a mock-up that our outreach coordinator did of the interpretive signage, was to be installed this summer. We also received a California Climate Investments Forest Health Grant to fund an additional 1,250 acres of reforestation, and we completed 700 and 800 acres this year, this spring. And then this would result in almost 2,000 acres reforested. But the creek fire happens. And if you're unfamiliar, the creek fire occurred on both sides of San Joaquin Watershed. The entire French fire burn scar was reburned within the first 72 hours of the creek fire. And those were 98% days. So there are only 2% of days that would have been worse for fire during that time. And so you can see, this is the result. This is an area that was reforested that is completely denuded of trees now. All of those sort of lighter marks are all where there were downed logs that then burned. So, you know, it is a pretty disheartening thing, but I will say that there is still hope. This was taken recently, and this is an area of reforestation that still survived. We are actually putting in for, because we don't have to pay huge contractual costs for site preparation, we're going to be replanting. We have already on the schedule next year for 600 acres of reforestation, and then we're requesting funding we're requesting to adjust our budget to do an additional 1,200 acres of reforestation in 2023 or 2022. So we are adapting to this change, and you know, it's disappointing that we lost a big chunk of our reforestation, but that's what happens, particularly when we're dealing with catastrophic wildfire. And I wanted to mention just briefly before I finish, is that one of the other initiatives that we're working on is with the Sierra Nevada Watershed Improvement Program. They have developed a capacity building program, and we're the Southern Subregion sub-grantee. Too many S's on that, but so we are working on capacity building and working on developing projects that focus on forest health and wildfire resilience. So we are doing a lot of like capacity building work, and we're really excited to be moving that program forward. And that's all for my presentation, and I'm open to questions now.
So the first one was from Jean about, did you have to go decide and find the funds for this, or were they available and you just came in as the administrator? So had you done this kind of business before and was identified as someone to administer funds?
So we actually, we partnered up with the Forest Service to solicit to send out grant applications. We actually originally proposed to, I think, a CAL FIRE grant program, this project. And then we weren't awarded, and so we went to S&C and were awarded, and then we subsequently got a CAL FIRE Forest Health grant for that additional 1,250 acres. So it's primarily that we are sort of going to the Forest Service and saying, what projects do you need to work on? Do you need private funding or support funding for? And then we are, you know, doing the applications and soliciting funding for those projects.
Okay. And do your project funds give you ongoing funding for maintenance on the planting sites, herbicide treatments on competition species that may be coming up, or is it kind of one and done?
So this grant didn't provide funds to complete those, but part of S&C grants is that we are required to provide a plan for long-term maintenance and monitoring. And so because we're working with the Forest Service, the Forest Service has committed to providing ongoing progress reports to S&C about the progress. And we usually go out every year. It was a little bit weird this year because of because we were finishing up, but I'm sure sometime next year we'll be going out with S&C and the Forest Service to monitor the project. So it's a pretty good program.
So the next one from Pam is, were you allowed to harvest the standing dead trees, or were the soils caramelized and felled trees used to control erosion on the slopes, or were they just burned?
So we were allowed to harvest the standing dead. I know there was some amount of timber sale. The problem is a lot of the trees were pretty heavily burned. So it really depends. The 3,000 acres were the acres that were, I believe there was like the NEPA was challenged. And so I think they modified the acres to be closer to 3,000 acres because of that challenge. And then they were able to harvest trees off of that remaining acreage.
And can you answer the soils question?
Yes. I am not sure if the felled trees were used to control erosion. I can check with our with the forester, the silviculturist on that and find out.
And Pam, do you want to ask about the soils being caramelized? I haven't heard that term before. caramelized? And you,
Okay, when a fire burns really, really hot, it practically seals the soil. Think of lava cooling and hardening, and it makes it very, very hard or almost impossible for any natural reforestation to happen, reseeding to happen. And I guess yours didn't burn that hot. I'm thinking about our fires in the Bitterroot, where we burned 340,000 acres in 2000. And we had a heck of a time with caramelized soil. And then when it rains, then every piece of duff and anything that's left comes right down and causes flooding because it's, you know, sediments in the creeks. So I'm not seeing that in yours, even with the 100% loss. Basically, it didn't look like the soil was hardened. Let's put it that way, hardened beyond use.
Yeah, the French fire was it was not it was not a fast fire. So although it burned through a lot of the material, it wasn't a fast fire like a lot of the ones that we've seen in the last 5 years. It was a pretty slow progression fire. So it really didn't have that sort of high intensity as far as burning or damage to the soils, but it did have a pretty significant impact to the trees and reduction in overall basal area.
okay. So,
So can I follow up on, I'm sorry, I want a quick follow up on my other question and your answer about the NEPA. Again, in the Bitterroot, we experienced cat fights about our, you know, being able to go in and harvest the timber. We were able to harvest on state lands, but we couldn't get through the log jam on federal forests, and it was all political. And it's too bad because we ended up with a whole lot of standing dead timber that could have been used immediately. And again, the state allowed that to happen, but the Forest Service got sued basically.
Mm-hmm.
did you have a mill that was closed for log processing if you could have used, or that you could have used?
There are two
Yeah,
mills that are that are in the area. So there's the Terabella mill, which is down in Tulare, that is somewhat close. And you know, most of the wood products go to Terabella, and then some of the wood products lately have been going up to like facilities in Stockton or Sacramento. So that's kind of a far distance. By and large, we don't have any local biomass. Yosemite Sequoia has been working with the North Fork Community Power Program to be developing a biomass facility in North Fork. And the hope is to get it online in next year. They have all the funding now, but you know, there was definitely a hope. We've been developing that since 2011. And so there definitely was a hope that some of this material could go to the bioenergy facility, and it just didn't hash out that way. So
As far as being the administrator, did you receive funding for personnel cost and overhead costs through the project, or did you have to offer in kind or match, or how did you staff up for this?
So Sierra Nevada Conservancy is very, we're thankful that Sierra Nevada Conservancy allows for indirect costs as part of their grant, of the grant agreement. So we were, I believe we took, I'm not sure how much, but I think it was about 10% indirect. And then some of that we actually pulled out to use as our project management for reporting, invoicing, stuff like that. So it did cover, you know, our staff time on the project, and it also covered some of our overhead during the grant period and we have a cost allocation plan to sort of set out how everything is balanced between our projects. And then we offered, because we had other grants at the time that could sort of match, we indicated match for some of our admin fees. So we reduced some of that percentage than what we could take as a match. And then we also did some outreach in kind through one of our other grants.
Okay, I'm gonna stop here. Can you stay on with us so we can take maybe some more questions at the end?
Definitely.
Okay. One last question, how many staff do you have?
We have, it's a little bit an odd question because we are on the verge of hiring 2 staff right now. But at the time that we were working on the French fire, we had 3 staff.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Justine. And if you'll hang on, we'll try to get some of this last question from George. But with that, if you'll stop sharing your screen, and we will go on to Ralph Smith. Ralph, do you have a video on your computer or just audio?
Just audio. Let's
Okay.
see about,
Okay.
got my presentation ready here. Let's see here. Give me 1 second.
Okay. And then, and as you get that on, Ralph, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be in watershed operations in Washington.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. My name is Ralph Smith, and I am, let me get this right here. I am the National Watershed Program Manager for NRCS, and I started with NRCS in Tennessee, and I am an engineer, and I have worked in watershed programs in Tennessee and have done details across in California, Georgia, Louisiana over the years, doing EWP, which is the Emergency Watershed Program, and with the this Watershed Operations Program. So that's my background, and I think, is there anything else you'd like to me to share? Dana, is that good?
Go ahead with your presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for having me today. And I'll be talking about the USDA NRCS Watershed Operations Program. And let's see here. So going to go quickly over a little bit of background of the PO 566 program. The authorized purposes that the program involves, statutory requirements, financial assistance, and funding. And a little time at the end for questions. And what I'll say off the bat here is that NRCS actually has 3 different watershed programs. There's the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Program. That's the one that I'm the program manager for. There's also the Watershed Rehabilitation Program and the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. And as I mentioned, I'm specifically dealing with the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Program. This program spawned from the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act and the foundation legislation the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention are the foundational legislation for Watershed Operations Program. I think it's covering up mode. Okay, there we go. My people were covering up. Okay, the Flood Control Act of 1940 and the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act, PO 566, are the foundational legislation for Watershed Operations Program. The purpose of the program was to authorize the Natural Resource Conservation Service, at the time SCS, to provide assistance in the planning and installation of flood control measures to reduce losses caused by flooding. The watershed program requires that the development of physically, environmentally, socially, and economically sound watershed project plans with action scheduled for implementation over a specified period of years. Watershed project plans contain project actions, which are formally planned undertakings carried out within a specific geographic area by sponsors for the benefit of the general public. PO 566 sets forth 3 general purposes. The first is preventing damage from erosion, floodwater, and sediment, furthering the conservation, development, utilization, and disposal of water, and furthering the conservation and proper utilization of land. Historically, RC&D councils and NRCS were actively involved in watershed projects together. A number of watershed projects involve multi-purpose flood retarding structures, dams, and they also involve recreational or water supply. And we'll get into purposes in more detail in just a moment. Here, okay. So these are the purposes that the Watershed Operations Program is involved with: flood prevention or flood damage reduction, watershed protection, public recreation, public fish and wildlife, agricultural water management, municipal and industrial water supply, water quality management, as well as watershed structure rehabilitation. So for the flood prevention purpose, this is historically a lot of the work in RCS did focused on flood protection. And for this purpose, flood prevention or flood damage reduction measures are installed to prevent or reduce damages caused by flood water. Flood damage reduction is further defined as the control and disposal of surface water caused by abnormally high direct precipitation, stream overflow, or floods aggravated or caused by wind or tidal effects. Flood damage reduction and mitigation measures reduce or prevent floodwater damages by reducing runoff, erosion, and sediment, modifying the susceptibility of improvements in the floodplain to damage, removing damageable property from the floodplain, or reducing the frequency, depth, or velocity of flooding. Measures may also include actions that prevent encroachment into the floodplain. This purpose frequently involves the building of floodwater retarding dams that help to slow the release of rainwater in a watershed so that homes or other buildings, as well as farmland, aren't flooded as frequently. Some rural communities have developed projects under this purpose that involve the construction of levees or even the total removal and relocation of vulnerable structures in the floodplain. The next purpose that we'll talk about is the watershed protection purpose, and it consists of land treatment practices within a watershed that result in reduced off-site flooding, erosion, sediment, and agricultural pollutants. Project measures result in conserved or developed soil, improved water quality or quantity, enhancements to woodland, fish, and wildlife habitat, recreation, and scenic resources. Watershed protection can also involve the conservation of energy. In Tennessee, NRCS worked with the town of Oneida to accomplish a project with this purpose in the Bear Creek watershed. That project resulted in aquatic life returning to reaches of Bear Creek that had been void of life for many years. Remnants of mining in the area during the 1800s resulted in acid mine drainage going directly into the creek, all but terminating any life in the local waterways. The project also had a tremendous unexpected benefit of economic development to the area, increased home sites, and the construction of a recreational sports complex. Under the public recreation purpose, measures may include picnic areas, sanitary facilities, fishing piers, shelters, cooking grills, parking areas, swimming beaches, access roads, water, and trails. Under the public fish and wildlife purpose, this purpose involves improvement of the habitat or the environment for the breeding, growth, and development of fish or other wildlife. The agricultural water management purpose includes drainage, groundwater recharge, irrigation, water conservation, water quality improvement, and agricultural, including rural communities' water supply. Work in this purpose must serve groups of landowners and communities. Several Western states are working with projects that involve upgrading open irrigation canals. By piping irrigation water, source water is conserved, and water is not lost in transmission or to evaporation. And there's the purpose of municipal and industrial water supply. This purpose covers those measures necessary to provide storage capacity in reservoirs to increase the availability of water for present and future municipal and industrial uses. Under this purpose, NRCS can work with sponsors to cover the cost of outlet works and pipelines to convey water from water bodies to existing or proposed treatment facilities or water systems. NRCS does not pay for the design of the systems. And then there's the water quality management purpose, and it provides water storage capacity and reservoirs for regulation of stream flow to improve water quality in streams. And then finally, there's the dam watershed structure rehabilitation purpose. And this purpose allows us to rehabilitate structures, dams that were built by NRCS and they have to have been built through one of these authorities, either PL 566, PL 534, the Pilot Watershed Program, or the Resource Conservation and Development Program, Agriculture and Food Act of 1981. A few other key things to consider with the NRCS Watershed Program. There are some statutory requirements, and the main one is that the sponsor of a project must meet certain eligibility requirements, and that includes the sponsor must have the power of eminent domain and the authority to levy taxes. Most sponsors are a unit of state government. On many projects, there may be several entities involved in the effort, with only one partner meeting the sponsorship requirements. For example, a state soil and water commission will be the project sponsor, and a local nonprofit will enter into an agreement to provide technical support, such as writing the watershed plan or doing the NEPA or the environmental documents. Another aspect of the program is these watershed projects must have agricultural benefits, including those to rural communities that comprise at least 20% of the benefits. And this benefits that we're talking about here is not acres, it's actually financial benefits that can be attributed to specific purposes. So all those purposes that I mentioned previously, we assess how much of the value or the cost benefit is associated with each of those purposes. And when you do all of that tabulation, 20% of the benefits have to be associated with agricultural or rural communities. Another aspect of the program is that our project areas must be less than 250,000 acres, and no single structure can provide more than 12,500 acre-feet of floodwater detention capacity, and project provides no more than a total of 25,000 acre-feet of total capacity. An appealing characteristic of this program is that it allows the agency to do projects on private lands. This includes not only property owned by ranchers and farmers, but non-agricultural landowners as well. I was actually involved in an EWP project in Southern California, I think it was around 2005, and that project involved removing, after pine beetle damage had, I guess, impacted a lot of the areas in Riverside County and San Diego County. They wanted to remove fuel in the corridors so that it would help. You would have the ways to egress and for people as well as fire personnel. So EWP, which is the partner sister program, was able to be used in that case to help remove those dead trees prior to some of the fires that would come later. And then even after fires, we could go in and take some of the debris in certain corridors. There was some very specific criteria. And I'm not really speaking here about that program, but that is a partner program that can also be used since we are talking about the watershed protection and fires today. So another thing here is that when it comes to watershed operations, this table shows the financial assistance that is available through the PL 566 program. Technical and financial support is available for planning, design, and engineering assistance, as well as cost share for construction implementation. The amount of assistance is tied to the purposes that are involved in the project. And we'll look at in more detail of a project that might involve watershed protection in the next slide. So let's say, for example, you had since we're talking about fire and then issues that might have compatible purposes here. You had a small community that was being impacted by flooding, and the thought was that you needed some flood protection structures to help reduce the flooding that the town is experiencing, the community is experiencing, and you also want to do some critical area planting around the area to help reduce sediment, that kind of sediment and other sort of ground-based, water-based pollutants or whatever. So the flood protection structures would be used to protect the small town. And in this example, what we could do here is 100% of the cost for designing and planning those flood structures could be picked up by NRCS, is 100% of the installation cost. And then for the flood protection, the critical area planning work, 100% of the engineering and technical assistance and planning could be covered by NRCS. And then depending on whatever the cost share is for, say, some other programs that NRCS administers in the area. So it might be a little bit different in California versus Wisconsin or Iowa versus Maine. But whatever the rate is for critical area planning is in that region, that's what the cost share that would be applied for watershed protection. Okay. So as far as funding, here's some information on the funding for the last 4 years that NRC has been provided through this program. So as you can see, in the last 4 years or so, we've gotten just about $1 billion in funding. The 2019 and 2020 years, there were an additional $50 million provided through the Farm Bill, and but with using the same authorities of the Watershed program, PO 566 program. And to access the program, you would work through your local NRCS state office, and there's engineering staff and ecological sciences staff, as well as area engineers and field district conservationists that would help at the sort of the front line of any effort. And those folks would work to help you enroll your project or to help you develop a project. In the case of fires, where it's often something where you need immediate assistance, you usually are talking about something more like EWP. But if you have a more longer window of time planning, a longer planning window where you're trying to address some almost infrastructure-like needs for the area that you're wanting to deal with, as you mentioned, I think it's caramelization. So I'm not sure if there's anything that could be done as far as a critical area planning or something that could be a practice type of thing that could be done to help with that. But if there was you're talking about maybe a 3 or 4 year window where you're trying to do some series of measures, then you could possibly utilize the Watershed Operations Program to come in and deal with that. And then if there were, as I mentioned in my example, structures that were needed for debris catches or debris basins or something like that, those could also be built through the Watershed Operations Program and potentially through EWP. It just kind of depends on, it's very site specific as far as the ways in which you can use EWP. So I guess I'm available for any questions now.
So
Ralph,
if a RC&D, if they don't have taxing authority, they could be part of the sponsor group as long as there were somebody that could do that, right?
That is correct.
And are there many RC&Ds that are part of projects right now or have applied to the program?
There haven't been a lot, but I would hope that, this effort, just talking today and making folks aware of the program. I mean, like I said earlier, historically, RC&D was, there were a lot of projects that were done through RC&D. I don't have the number for you, but I know that they were, and there were we have a lot of products in our inventory that say RC&D measured, whatever the name is. So we have in the past partnered very closely, and then after things changed and RC&Ds were not funded, then that definitely changed things. But the opportunity and the partners that you all work with closely are, we can all work together to accomplish some pretty good conservation and some larger scale projects. And usually the challenge is, money, right? And so right now we've got, NRCS has quite a bit of funds available for projects that fit some of those purposes that I mentioned. And, we are actively wanting to do not only dams and big structures like that, but get more involved with all kinds of efforts that are going to have a positive impact on the landscape. So like I mentioned, the irrigation canals, going and putting those in pipes, but we've got several projects also that involve like aquatic species passage, where I think this is in Massachusetts or somewhere in New England. They are going in the watershed, and I'm not sure who the group is they're doing this with, but they are retrofitting or reworking a lot of the culverts and corridors to help with aquatic fish passage. So that's something that's really, I think, kind of pretty cool, and something that like an RC&D entity, along with other partners coming together with an RCS, you know, if there was interest in doing that would really fit the direction the program is going.
So what would be the first steps that an RC&D and their partners would take to think if they had a project, whether it was a short-term emergency watershed program because they've had a natural disaster, or a longer view, as you said, in operations? What should they do first? Would they call you and start the conversation, or how does that work?
What they would want to do is reach out to the local, every state has an NRCS state office, and in most counties there is an NRCS district conservationist, and if there's not a physical office in the county, there is an office, either a neighboring office or someone close by. So you could reach out first to your district conservationist and make contact with that person. There's also within NRCS, within each state office, there's a program manager at the state level for the EWP program, as well as the operations program. So either reaching out to the DC or making contact to the state office. You can go to the website, nrcs.usda.gov, and find the contact information for the state office personnel. And either like I said, the DC or the state office program manager can help point you in the right direction. And what they'll normally do is, if it's an event, say if it's a fire or something like that, we are not really the first responders. We're kind of the second responders, if you will, almost, because FEMA usually comes in and does several things, and then we come in a little bit later, and we're kind of working that relationship out a little bit more now. But like I said, we have certain things that we can do, and then with EWP, there's some additional constraints on what those funds can be used for and where they can be used. But that is, you know, that's what when either the DC or the folks from the state office come out to visit the situation, to visit the site where the incident has occurred, they'll make that assessment and tell you what they can and can't do.
So are there funds available for new projects in any of these programs now, or are there applications waiting for those right now?
So with EWP, it's an ongoing, anytime there's an event, there's the requests go in and a damage survey report is done. And that's what I was sort of speaking on as far as when the DCs or the state office folks come out, and they will make an assessment. And if the damage survey report is approved by the state conservationist, then things will move forward to request funding from headquarters. With operations, as I mentioned, the list of years, I'll get back up there. So we've gotten these funds the last couple of years, and we actually have more requests than we don't necessarily approve all the requests for funding, but we've gotten more requests than we've had funds. However, the funds that have gone out, I'll just say there's opportunity there. Currently there's opportunity. So if there were projects that people wanted to seek to determine if they could be funded, or if it even matches the program, after you make contact with the state office or with the DC, they would direct you as to how to prepare a funding proposal or to put in an application for a project. And with operations, we also have the opportunity to do what we call a preliminary investigation, so that we can determine if your project really matches NRCS and the purposes that I outlined. And so that process takes a couple months, or it could take as long as a year, but there's funds for all of that. And I guess it's kind of been, the folks who know about the program are definitely accessing it, but we have seen an uptick in the amount of people participating and requesting projects. So I guess hopefully as the word gets out more and more, we'll we will use more of these funds. So I'm just saying we haven't used them all. And so if you have projects and ideas, I would encourage you to reach out to your local NRCS folks and get them in the queue. So.
Okay. And if Ralph and Justine will send us these presentations, of course, we will send them on to all of you. So you'll have his contact information there. We've got just a few minutes. I'm going to jump back to Justine while you're doing this post-survey. And so Justine, was this work on public lands? And in your second fire, you know, what kind of intensity in acres did that happen?
So the French fire was entirely on public lands. It was, I'm forgetting, it was 14,000 acres on entirely on public lands. The creek fire, I think the total currently is 389,000 acres, which is the largest single fire in California. We have a lot of like complex fires that are larger than that. In terms of severity, most of that data is not quite out yet. The soil severity, I saw some maps that looked pretty good for soil severity, but I haven't seen anything that comes across as to what the like basal area or tree loss was for the area. But we had on the Fresno side, there was a pretty significant amount of home loss on that side. So
I also want to know, what are the kinds of products you would be producing besides chips and for biomass plants?
So at the North Fork Mill site, there's also currently a pallet maker in that on that property. There's also a reclaimed wood processor. So there's already a little bit of a wood market there, but primarily the bioenergy facility would be using biomass gasification to produce energy, or and also production of biochar is something that they're also looking at.
And did you apply for any of the Joint Chiefs funding that U.S. Forest Service and NRCS had?
We didn't apply for Joint Chiefs. NRCS and the Forest Service worked together to do some Joint Chiefs applications for the High Sierra side of the Bass Lake Range of the Sierra National Forest. And that was actually a bunch of work that went into protecting some of the areas that were protected from the creek fire because of a lot of that pre-work that they did around that. It was called the Acorn Project.
So if all of you will look in the chat, Roy Settle also talked about options for using AmeriCorps to do some planting and other things that they had in the Appalachian RC&D area that we're in. But as a kind of a final question, Justine, what were your lessons learned on things like relationships and, you know, quick response, adapting to what you needed to do?
Well, I'd say during the French Fire project, it was a lot about, you know, having a strong relationship with if you're working with the Forest Service, having strong relationship with your implementation partner and making sure that you're on the same page. You know, we have a really strong relationship with the Bass Lake Ranger District now, and it's led to a lot of other opportunities that came from developing this strong relationship through this grant. And then I also, you know, in following up with the French fire and then the creek fire is just, you know, going for whatever you can and then being flexible and particularly looking for opportunities for grants that will provide that flexibility. Like, we're really thankful that CAL FIRE and the Forest Health Grant that we have, they're really working with us to modify our agreement so that we can, you know, make those changes that are needed to make it a better application. So.
Okay. Looks like it's a lot of work, and still with our climate that we have now, the more of it, it looks like over there in a lot of different places. Well, with that, I'm going to say that our next session will be on January 14th. You'll get a notice of that. Our topic will be wetland and wildlife. We'll be featuring the Delmarva RC&D. It's going to be talking about some wetland restoration that they do. on the Delmarva Peninsula, and we'll have some specialists from ecological sciences in Washington, D.C. talking about wetland and wildlife. And so we appreciate everybody being here today. And you will follow up with them, Susan, as far as the PowerPoints and speaker contacts.
Yes, we will get all that out to everybody in the next few days. We'll send out the contact information, and as soon as we get the webinar edited, we'll send that out as well. And information on the next webinar, so you guys can register for that as well.
So thank you again to our speakers, Justine and Ralph, and thank you for putting your presentations together for us and for everybody staying on time. Thank you, and goodbye.